I was a skeptic my whole life. I didn't believe, didn't even entertain the idea that anything paranormal, magical, or otherworldly could exist. For me, there was only one way to understand the world: the scientific method, logic, reason, evidence. And yet, deep down there was always this quiet pull toward the irrational. I wasn't into the occult or anything like that. Not really. I was just curious. I'd read, watch, explore. For me, it was all about the atmosphere, the visuals, the aesthetic. Inspiring, yes, but never serious. Then one day, I stumbled across tarot, totally by accident, and it changed the way I see things. Not because the cards showed me magic, but because they showed me just how little I actually understand. And in that not knowing, I felt something new. A deep, honest respect for the mystery. I lay out a few random cards in front of me. I ask a question, and somehow I get a clear, grounded, thoughtful answer, and it hits right at the heart of what I'm asking. At first, I brushed it off, figured it was just coincidence. No big deal. But after a few more spreads, I realized this wasn't random. Something was definitely happening. And I couldn't shake the question: how? How does tarot respond so precisely to my inner thoughts? How do these cards reflect things I haven't even fully said out loud? So, I started digging. I watched countless videos, read a ton of books. A lot of it was shallow, full of fluff and vague promises. But then I found a few voices that stood out. Grounded, thoughtful. People who took this seriously and really understood what they were talking about. They helped me see tarot not as some tool for fortune-telling, but as a symbolic language, a way to hear yourself more clearly. I also came to realize that the informational landscape around tarot is, to put it mildly, in a pretty poor state. And that's exactly why I decided to make this video, to bring at least some clarity into it. Many people in the esoteric space, including professional tarot readers, seem to actively avoid digging into the actual mechanics of the tools they use, as if understanding them too deeply might break the spell. I believe the reason for this is fear. The fear of shattering that magical fairy tale world of runes and mermaids. It's the belief that if you apply logic and cognitive thinking to magic, it will simply vanish. That breaking it down will somehow drain it of meaning. But I'm convinced of the opposite. When you explore something deeply, when you truly understand how it works, it doesn't lose its magic. It becomes richer, more powerful, more real. Because that's when you unlock the full potential of the tool. Not as a fantasy, but as a symbolic language. One that lets you work with yourself and the world in a truly transformative way. Understanding gives you the ability to choose the most appropriate tool for any situation. Or, if we're talking about tarot, the most relevant arcana, and to use it in the most effective way. So if simply believing is no longer enough for you, if you want to truly know your deck, to understand it from the inside out, and to use it consciously and with purpose, then I invite you to join me on this journey. I believe that after this video, your deck will feel more personal to you, more familiar, more alive, more meaningful. I'm going to start this story from far away, and we probably won't get to the actual tarot cards until the middle of the video, maybe even later. But everything I'll be talking about before that, I believe, is absolutely essential to truly understand what tarot is, and more importantly, how it works. there's a field of human knowledge called semiotics. For the sake of simplicity, I'll refer to it as a science, even though, formally speaking, it's not classified as one. Semiotics is the study of sign systems. In other words, it explores how one object communicates information to another. Because typically, this medium of transmission is a sign, an element within some kind of symbolic or sign-based system. The clearest example of a sign system for us is human language. Obviously, when one person wants to communicate something about an object or phenomenon to another, they can't just transfer that object directly into the other person's mind. To share the idea of it, we assign the object a sign, a name, a symbol, and then pass that sign along instead. Even though each sign, as part of a given system, is usually tied to a specific referent, human perception still allows for a degree of variation in how signs are interpreted. And this variation is caused by the distorting lens of personal discourse, the unique context in which each person lives. Our perception is burdened, shaped, and distorted by emotional attachment to information, by past experience, and by the intrusion of the unconscious into how we process what we see. This weight often prevents the mind from interpreting incoming data in any way other than through a pre-existing personal context. In other words, every person lives inside their own isolated bubble of perception, their own personalized version of reality. If you're drawn to esotericism, you've probably already felt that most magical work is rooted in this variability, the conscious transformation of the self. To shift your context, to take off one lens and put on another, because doing so changes your behavior, your worldview, and the direction of your actions. In esoteric circles, this process is often called a shift of the assemblage point. Semiotics classifies signs into several types: iconic signs, indexical signs, and symbolic signs. Indexical signs attempt to imitate or directly point to a real-world object. Typical examples include drawings, photographs, and so on. For example, a child's drawing of their family, a photo or sketch of your cat, or a composite sketch of a criminal. Obviously, a drawing of your cat doesn't stand for the idea of cats in general. It points to one specific cat. Just like a sketch of a suspect points to one individual. An indexical sign is one that is connected to its referent by a temporal or causal relationship. Let's say you see a thick column of smoke on the horizon. That smoke is an indexical sign. It tells you there's a fire somewhere over there. Or, your friend reeks of alcohol the next morning. Another indexical sign, letting you know they had a really good time last night. The third type of signs is symbols. What makes symbols particularly interesting is that they're fundamentally different from other types of signs. Unlike iconic or indexical signs, symbols are not tied to a single specific object or meaning. Instead, symbols carry entire fields of meaning. In other words, a single symbol can point to, or rather, evoke, multiple ideas, sometimes even contradictory ones. From this characteristic arises the phenomenon known as amplification. Amplification, formally speaking, is the intersection of the semantic fields of different symbols. Several symbols may share a common conceptual aspect, a shared core, that exists within each of their meaning fields. When these symbols are placed together within a shared context, they begin to resonate with one another. They amplify each other's meaning. This interaction, this symbolic resonance, creates a dominant layer of meaning within that context. Because the overlapping semantic aspects become intensely emphasized through amplification. This is exactly how the major arcana of the tarot works, for example. Let's take the High Priestess card from the Rider-Waite deck as an example. To keep things simple, let's say that the core idea of this card is the concept of mystery. What do we see? A feminine figure, several lunar symbols. The moon is also a symbol, one that belongs to the field of the feminine principle. And not only does the moon appear only under the cover of night, but it always shows us only one side. The other remains hidden. In other words, the moon symbol carries the aspect of mystery within its semantic field. It is also linked to the symbolism of water, since the moon governs the tides. Water is present in this card as well. For instance, in the flowing robes of the High Priestess herself. Like the moon, water belongs to the feminine symbolic domain, and like the moon, it carries mystery within it. We don't know how many ancient monuments lie buried beneath the sea. Even in the modern world, we still don't fully understand what monstrous creatures live in its depths. And the deeper one dives, the more bizarre and terrifying those creatures seem to become. The same idea is visually reinforced in the card. Behind the High Priestess, there is a veil, a curtain that hides an entire ocean from us. The curtain itself, well, it hardly needs explanation. By its very presence, it conceals something. It's a symbol of the hidden, of that which is not yet revealed. In the hands of the priestess, there's also a scroll, a sacred text, which she partially hides beneath her robes. This implies that she's willing to share knowledge, but only partially. She keeps some truths veiled. And now, if we look at all these symbols not in isolation but together, as they're presented in the card, we can see how the theme of mystery is amplified by their interaction. The symbols resonate. They reinforce one another, and together they create a symbolic dominant. This is the essence of amplification in symbolic language. This is the characteristic of mass resonance. You can't just scribble some nonsense on paper and call it a symbol. That doesn't make it a symbol. A simple test proves the point. Look at your little doodle. And then look at the Ankh, the ancient Egyptian symbol. In the first case, it's one person and 2 minutes. In the second, it's hundreds of thousands of people across thousands of years who saw something shared, something real, in that symbol. And this idea of symbolic universality leads us straight to the Ankh and to its archetypal origin. People often say that symbols aren't invented, they're discovered, and I think that's absolutely true. It perfectly reflects how symbols actually emerge, not as creations, but as revelations. Even though the concept of the archetype was introduced into common usage relatively recently, in today's world, it's already been watered down quite a bit. Take this. If you have no idea what an archetype really is, and you go looking for answers on YouTube, chances are you'll stumble upon videos like brand archetypes in marketing, or personality types in socionics, or male archetypes in relationships. None of that has anything to do with the actual concept of the archetype. I mean, seriously. I once saw someone talking about the McDonald's archetype. People who actually understand what archetypes are probably passed out hearing that, the way I almost did. Today, we treat the word archetype like a sticker, something you slap on any phenomenon to label it, to classify it, to reduce it to a neat little category. Some authors, desperate to add a layer of philosophical weight to their otherwise shallow personality catalogs, throw in the term archetype to make it sound deep. But in truth, archetypes are tied to things so profoundly deep, it's hard to even grasp them, let alone fully imagine them. An archetype is a symbolic expression of unconscious processes. Some say, a symbolic expression of unconscious instincts, which, in essence, is the same thing. You could also say an archetype is the way consciousness perceives the unconscious at different stages of its development. Let me explain what's actually going on here. In our psyche, there are two major structures, the conscious and the unconscious. Consciousness is the part that perceives and processes information, both from the outside world and from within, from the unconscious. And both of these forces tend to expand, each trying to occupy more and more space within the psyche. Consciousness, whether we look at it through the lens of the entire human species or a single individual, is young and fragile compared to the ancient and powerful unconscious. In evolutionary terms, the unconscious was present in our ancestors for millions of years before consciousness ever emerged. And in individual terms, the unconscious exists in the body before consciousness appears. A newborn baby, or even more so, an unborn fetus, doesn't yet have consciousness. It develops later. Yet, despite its youth and weakness, consciousness seeks to consume the unconscious. It gains strength and stability through this process of absorbing it, but it also fears being consumed in return. In order to survive, consciousness tries to bring shape and structure to the chaotic signals of the unconscious. In other words, it tries to interpret the unconscious in a way that feels manageable and safe. Put differently, we can say that consciousness tries to imagine the unconscious. The unconscious is given to us in the form of imagery, emotions, and instinctive reactions. In other words, things we clearly can't control consciously. These manifestations are, by their nature, difficult to formalize, and even harder to truly picture. For example, you can't actually imagine the emotion of anger itself. What you can imagine is an image that represents anger. And just like that, in its early stages, consciousness perceives the unconscious as a single, indivisible mass, a vast, unified image. This image is what we call an archetype, a symbolic expression of the unconscious. In the example I've given, this would be the archetype of the Great Mother. But simply perceiving the archetype isn't enough to begin integrating unconscious content. This unified archetype is powerful, far too much for a fragile, unstable consciousness to handle all at once. So, at a certain stage of development, consciousness learns to fragment the archetype. Fragmentation means breaking off small parts of the archetype and processing them, because consciousness can handle the psychic charge of smaller pieces. Through this fragmentation, other archetypes emerge. Once consciousness learns to divide the archetype into smaller segments, it continues using that strategy. It breaks the archetypes down further and further into smaller and smaller fragments, and those fragments are what we call symbols. Symbols can take many forms. A symbol can take the form of a simple graphic sign, what we usually think of when we hear the word symbol. But it can also be an archetypal image, a figure, like that of an ancient deity. In this sense, a symbol is the result of archetypal fragmentation. It's the form through which consciousness perceives the unconscious. At this point, it should be clear that an archetype is far more than just a label. It's a complex tangle of sensations, emotions, drives, inherited behavioral patterns, and layered interactions between the conscious and unconscious. Because the symbol is directly connected to the archetype, it carries a powerful psychic charge. More accurately, a symbol conducts that psychic charge, channeling it from the unconscious into consciousness. The archetypal images and symbols of antiquity have long since been fragmented and absorbed by the modern mind. Whereas in ancient times, a person could contemplate the image of Jupiter for a few minutes and fall into a state of religious ecstasy or possession. Today, even the fragmented remnants of those archetypes still hold immense influence over us. They remain powerful conductors of psychic energy. They're keys to the doors of the archetype. And that's precisely why they're used so often in magic and occult practice. The figures depicted on the major arcana of the tarot are archetypal images. A single card can reflect aspects of several larger archetypal structures, or it can express just one. For example, the High Priestess is often seen as an embodiment of the anima archetype. The Empress represents the archetype of the Good Mother. The Fool combines elements of multiple archetypes: the Great Mother, the Hero, and the Shadow. Because of their archetypal nature, the major arcana cards have the power to affect us deeply. Vast layers of our psyche are structured around the same images found in the tarot. That's why these cards quite literally resonate with the psyche. They awaken forgotten or repressed ideas, emotions, and sensations. Tarot can help bring unconscious content to the surface and make it accessible to conscious awareness. Keeping this in mind, let's now look at the mechanism that makes tarot such an effective tool for inner work. To do that, we need to understand another key phenomenon: projection. As we said earlier, both consciousness and the unconscious strive to expand, to fill empty space. Because of this tendency, the psyche naturally generates projections, but it also has the ability to dissolve them. Projection is an unconscious process in which we assign elements of our inner world to something in the external world. A typical example is the image of a savior, which many people project onto certain individuals. They place their hopes for change, their dissatisfaction with life, onto a real person who, in their mind, is supposed to gather them and lead them into a brighter future. And often, no one is really interested in the actual person behind that projected image. So when such a savior acts in ways that don't align with what people expect, it creates fear, deep disappointment, and sometimes even rage. Another powerful example of projection is homophobia among men. At some point, a man might encounter something within himself, a trace of same-sex attraction, and reject it so strongly that he completely forgets it ever happened. In other words, he pushes it into the realm of the shadow. The shadow is a kind of psychological prison, a place for everything rejected, unchosen, and denied. And the archetype of the shadow is often a source of projection. So when this man sees two men holding hands on the street, it triggers disgust, contempt, even hatred. Why? Because he's projecting his own unconscious impulses from his shadow onto those men. To him, they become a projection. They represent the unknown. And that's a crucial insight. Humans tend to project, but they project only onto what is unknown. He doesn't know who they are, what kind of people they are, what their personalities are like, what interests they have. In fact, he doesn't care. But even without knowing, he unconsciously projects his internal material onto them and begins to hate them for it. That is projection. Your worldview, mine, yours, everyone's, is one giant mosaic of projections. Because the truth is, no one can know everything. And, as I said earlier, consciousness can only destroy projections through awareness. If you truly know something, you can no longer project onto it. Let's go back to the examples I gave earlier. Say you're not just a follower of someone who projects the image of a savior onto a person. Say you're their close friend. You see how they eat, how they mess up, how they argue with people, how they live, how they drive, how they go to work, how they post online, all of it. In short, to you, they're just a person, a default human, your friend. And in that case, you simply can't project the savior image onto them anymore. Now back to the second example. Let's say a homophobic man somehow ends up with a gay friend. It happens. I don't know how, but it does. Obviously, he's not going to hate that friend. Why? Because he knows him. He's no longer projecting his repressed urges onto a stranger. This is someone he's familiar with. What this shows us is that the unconscious tends to flood into the parts of our perception that are still unknown. It fills in the blanks. And that's exactly what's happening with tarot. Each tarot reading presents random cards, each holding archetypal images and symbolic elements, and each spread is an encounter with the unknown. Because every new reading is shaped by a new question, a question that's never been asked in quite that way before. Individually, the interpretation will still be different every single time. Just for fun, take a look at this number. This is the total number of all possible tarot spreads from a 78 card deck. 1 card, 2 cards, 3 cards, all the way to 78. Every possible combination lives in that number. Clearly, that many meanings can't be memorized or fully learned, which means that every time you do a spread, you're forced to construct meaning from scratch, often by projecting your inner content onto the images in front of you. So now, fully prepared and equipped with the knowledge, let's finally dive into the types of questions you can ask the tarot. And, more importantly, why those specific kinds of questions seem to work. I've divided tarot practice into a few categories: self-discovery and psychological insight, situational analysis and guidance, magic, or in modern terms, self-programming prediction, and separately, direct access to future information. And yes, I'm separating direct information from the future, from prediction, because they work differently. Let's explore what all these methods have in common. Self-discovery and inner work rely heavily on the mechanism of projection. When you ask questions about yourself, your emotional state, your blind spots, your shadow, you inevitably project your own perceptions and emotions onto the symbols in the cards. Simply by being human, you will inevitably project your own feelings onto images. That's just how we work. The collective unconscious is called collective for a reason. It's shared among all of us. And because the archetypal images and symbols on tarot cards are directly connected to that unconscious, they will resonate with you every time. You'll find reflections of yourself in them, whether you try to or not. In this kind of work, tarot literally illuminates your unconscious. That part of you that lives in bodily sensations, emotions, involuntary reactions, dreams, and half-formed thoughts. Let's say you often feel anxious. Maybe your heart races for no clear reason. You feel a strange tightness in your chest, but nothing is actually happening on the outside. You seem calm. Life seems normal. Then you ask a question, and it's like you begin to walk into a dark forest, carefully following a thin thread tied between the trees. And deep in that forest, there's an old moss-covered chest surrounded by cold fog. That chest holds the answer, the root of your emotional state. It's worth noting that while emotional involvement can be helpful in other types of tarot work, when it comes to self-discovery and psychological insight, it can get in the way. In this context, emotion is a distraction. You need to distance yourself from your emotions, your feelings, and place your consciousness in a cold, rational, analytical position. This is necessary so that you can evaluate and analyze your sensations. When you lay down a card, your mind begins scanning through possible meanings, and at some point, you feel it, an emotional jolt, a subtle reaction. That moment signals you've touched something true. If you follow that jolt, you initiate projection. It might feel like you're just spiraling inward, but with enough self-awareness, it leads you to the core of the issue. As you can see, tarot as a tool for psychological work isn't that different from modern therapeutic methods, like art therapy or internal role play. It has its advantages, and also a dialectical drawback. With tarot, you're working alone. There's no broken telephone, no attempt to squeeze raw, emotional content through the imperfect lens of human language to a therapist who then filters, digests, and reflects it back to you, often in a form that's disconnected from the original meaning. In that chain of translation, something gets lost. The emotional charge, the symbolic weight, the instinctive clarity. With tarot, you're getting the insight and interpreting it directly from the source. But like I said, this comes with a cost. This kind of work demands strong self-awareness, real introspection, and radical honesty with yourself. You need a well-developed consciousness. Otherwise, it's like entering a deep forest with only the thinnest thread to guide you, trying to unravel what exactly you've created in your own mind. Now, working with tarot for advice or real-life problem-solving operates on a different level, even if the questions often sound similar. Here, we return to the basic model introduced earlier, the one describing how information moves between subjects. Remember, consciousness is immersed in a personal context. It tends to interpret everything through pre-existing filters. A tarot spread becomes a field of the unknown, and that field gives your mind the chance to construct a new perspective on your situation. How does it work? A question is asked, something specific. That question defines the context within which the tarot spread will be interpreted. And because the cards that appear are random, the person must construct meaning from them, finding points of resonance between the symbols, and then translating that symbolic structure into a sentence they can consciously grasp. This creates two perspectives, the one embedded in the personal narrative, and a new one, a step outside that narrative, allowing the person to view the situation from a different vantage point. In this way, tarot can pull someone out of their own limited internal discourse. Unlike self-inquiry or deep psychological work, these types of practical questions don't necessarily require engaging the unconscious. Here, the emphasis is on cold, analytical processing, conscious effort. So although in both cases the tarot spread represents a field of the unknown, in one, it becomes a canvas for projection, and in the other, a ground for rational construction. In many ways, working with tarot for either self-exploration or real-world situations resembles the creative process. In both, a person builds new meaning out of raw, unordered material. And despite popular belief, human creativity doesn't arise out of nowhere. We don't make tools without a need for them. We don't create art if we have nothing to express. Humans are not creators in the divine sense, not truly. We don't manifest something from nothing. No work of art, no idea, no symbol emerges out of thin air. It's more accurate to say that we are not great creators. We are great transformers. And that's an ideal metaphor for how consciousness works. Consciousness does not invent itself. It reshapes itself using the raw material of the unconscious. Long before early humans ever shaped their first stone tools, they simply picked up what they found lying on the ground. Only after that did humans begin to intentionally shape stones into sharp flakes and tools. Before developing complex ideas, a philosopher studies the thoughts of those who came before. Before writing a composition, a musician listens to and studies many works written by others. Consciousness strengthens itself by drawing from both the external and internal worlds. In short, to create something, something must already exist. And that explains why progress in ancient times was slow, and why it's so fast today. We now stand on an enormous foundation of accumulated knowledge and experience. It doesn't matter what that experience is, whether it's generations of sharpening stone against stone, or the legacy of philosophical ideas. This is where tarot comes in. When used for self-discovery or understanding a situation, tarot becomes that foundation. It becomes the shore from which we push off before swimming out. Before a tarot reading, you might have no thoughts about the situation other than your own looped perspective. But once you ask the question and lay the cards, you activate your creative force. You give it material, fuel, something to push against. And that moment kickstarts the construction of a new meaning, a new way of seeing what's in front of you. Tarot works in a similar way when used in a magical context. Magic has existed for as long as humanity has. But what is it really? A magical act, whether it's a ritual, a prayer, a sacrifice, or anything else, is, at its core, a way of communicating with the unconscious. Magical acts are always accompanied by symbols or archetypal figures: gods, demons, angels, spirits, sigils, alchemical diagrams, mythical stories. As we've said before, a symbol is a conduit for psychic energy. This energy is called libido, the driving force behind all human action. It's the fuel that powers the psyche. A symbol exists halfway in the unconscious and halfway in consciousness, accessible to both the rational mind and the deep inner world. Take the image of Mars, for example. Consciously, we see a masculine warrior, his weapon symbolizing not just readiness for battle, but outward-facing aggression, phallic assertiveness, and the archetype of masculine force. This is the conscious interpretation, the surface meaning. But if you reflect on this image for just a few minutes, you might feel the fire of that symbol start to move through you. Suddenly you feel more confident, more sure of yourself, more ready to assert your truth, maybe even forcefully. That feeling, the emotional charge, is what we call Martian energy. It reveals the unconscious aspect of the symbol. This emotional reaction, this infusion of energy, is libido being transferred from the unconscious into consciousness. And that's how a symbol works. This is also the magic behind ancient rituals. Early farmers might have performed the bare minimum to survive, but when they believed their work was an offering to the Earth Mother, it gave the work meaning, power, and spiritual purpose. A warrior didn't just go to war. He stepped onto the battlefield under the protection of the god of war himself. That belief gave him strength, even ecstasy. It was the transfer of libido, through image, through meaning, that made effort possible. This is how humans have always empowered themselves to act. Libido, when channeled into consciousness through the archetypal image of the Earth Mother, could make a person plow the fields tirelessly and actually feel fulfilled doing it. Likewise, libido poured through the image of the god of war gave warriors fearlessness, driving them to keep fighting. That's why in ancient times, no significant action was ever taken without a ritual beforehand. But the modern mind, stable and self-aware, no longer blindly submits to the pull of libido. Unlike in ancient times, when each god symbolized a different direction of psychic energy, today's consciousness has learned to direct that energy on its own. For example, after meditating on the image of Mars and absorbing that aggressive, bold energy, a modern person doesn't pick up a sword and head into battle. They launch into their projects with confidence, ready to compete, ready to win. Likewise, by connecting with an image of an earth or fertility goddess, they don't head out to till soil. They gain patience, diligence, and focus to see their long-term efforts through. In short, it's not libido directing you anymore. It's you directing libido, guiding that flow wherever you need it to go. That, essentially, is magic. In tarot, we don't always see divine figures, and that's okay. They often carry specific cultural weight. The major arcana is powerful precisely because it contains broader, more universal archetypes, perfect for channeling libido from the unconscious into consciousness. That energy transfer happens through meditation on the arcana. But to do this, you must understand what each card truly represents, what aspect of the psyche or life it reflects. For example, when your life feels like total chaos and you're desperate to restore order. You can use different tarot cards for this kind of practice. For example, the Magician, which symbolizes the conscious mind, action, and the will to shape reality. Or the Emperor, which stands for structure, authority, and order. Naturally, the energy you absorb while focusing on each will be completely different. You'll behave differently. You'll interpret the world differently. When working magically, even with tarot, you must learn to surrender to the libido that fills you. Meditation on a card is not the same as doing a spread. There's no need for interpretation or analysis. You're not supposed to think. You just need to shift something deep inside. Open the inner gate and allow that psychic energy to pour in. I had an interesting realization about this. It seems that the sensations we experience during this kind of meditation, or the way we describe them, might actually depend on our zodiac element. It's just a personal theory, but I'm an air sign, and when I meditate on a card, I feel that energy rise inside me like a tide. It floods me, soft, fluid, powerful. Maybe someone of fire would feel it as heat, someone of air as lightness or wind. Maybe someone of earth would feel grounded and solid, like stone. Whatever it is, what matters is the connection, the card, the image, the energy, and the way it moves through you. Let's now talk about tarot's predictive power. Prediction, in many ways, depends on your attitude toward it. Some people treat predictions like fate, as if they're receiving a sentence, and once they do, they start spiraling, filled with fear, doubt, and anxiety. And in doing so, they often unconsciously fulfill the prediction themselves. This pattern is found in countless myths and stories. A king hears a prophecy, tries to avoid it, and ends up walking straight into it. But once you escape that mental trap, you gain a powerful realization. You have the ability to choose your own path. That's why, when working with tarot, the way you phrase your question matters. Not, "What will happen to me?" but rather, "What's the most likely outcome if things stay as they are?" This way, you leave space for alternate outcomes you can shift toward by taking action. Tarot becomes a kind of simulation ground. You can ask, what should I do to move toward a different result? What can I change to increase the odds of another outcome? Because in truth, the answer is already inside you. You just can't see it clearly. It lives in the unconscious, in the form of gut feelings, doubts, fears, and hopes about the future. Think of flipping a coin to decide something. Everyone knows the feeling when the wrong side lands. You suddenly realize, deep down, you already had an answer. You just needed a little push to hear it. Tarot works the same way, but with far more depth. It reflects your inner knowing, and more importantly, it helps you fine-tune your mindset. When you explore upcoming possibilities, ask what to avoid or how to prepare, you begin aligning yourself with a possible future. In a sense, the real purpose of prediction isn't to discover the future, it's to start building it. And now, let's talk about something that, quite honestly, might be impossible to fully explain, at least for now. I'm talking about those moments when tarot gives you highly specific information, details that you do not currently know, cannot guess, and could not possibly predict, but that soon turn out to be true. Let's explore this in the broader context of how tarot works, because this strange phenomenon we're about to discuss connects all forms of tarot practice I've mentioned so far. To me, it remains the most mysterious experience I've encountered in my life. Face-to-face, undeniable. Its name is synchronicity, a term introduced by Carl Gustav Jung. He formulated several ideas around this concept, based on experiments and studies that had been conducted during his lifetime. Jung defined synchronicity as a causal connecting principle. He suggested that in addition to cause and effect, which we rely on to explain everything around us, there exists another kind of link between events. From his studies into extrasensory perception and telepathy, he proposed that this link might be psychoid in nature. One experiment involved people trying to guess 5 randomly selected cards from a set of 25, each with a unique symbol, drawn by a machine they could not see. Statistically, the results should have followed pure chance, but they didn't. In almost every test, people guessed more correctly than randomness would allow. In one astonishing case, a person guessed all 25 correctly. The probability of this is so astronomically low, it's essentially impossible. And yet, it happened. The researchers expanded the experiment. They tested distance, placing subjects in nearby rooms across the building, even in other cities and continents, and distance had zero effect. The phenomenon persisted. What's even more astonishing is that time, like space, had no effect on the results. In one variation of the experiment, participants were asked to guess which cards would be drawn not now, but 2 days from now. Even then, the results consistently exceeded chance. There was another experiment involving dice. A machine would roll the dice, and a person in a separate room was instructed to focus intently, to truly wish for a specific number, hoping it would show up more often than the rest. And the data showed something remarkable. When the participant genuinely concentrated on, say, rolling threes, the machine began producing more threes. Further trials revealed that emotional engagement mattered. When a person was motivated, invested, their intention had a stronger effect. But if they were exhausted or bored, if the experiment dragged on and they no longer cared, the targeted number actually showed up less frequently than chance. Based on these results, Jung concluded that another kind of connection must exist, one that doesn't rely on causality, one that ignores distance, space, and even time. He called it a psychoid link, because clearly, emotion plays a central role. In simple terms, synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence, a moment that defies logical cause and effect, but still makes undeniable sense. Jung put it best. This connection isn't causal, it's symbolic, and most of us have experienced it. When you're deeply focused on an idea, starting a new chapter in life, or going through something profound, events begin to echo your inner world. External reality starts to reflect what's happening inside you. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine you have a date tomorrow. You're nervous. You start obsessing. What flowers should I bring? And suddenly, flowers begin to appear everywhere. I don't mean just noticing the flower shop on your block that you've always ignored. No, I'm talking about real synchronicity. Out of nowhere, an old colleague you haven't spoken to in years calls you up and somehow starts talking about flowers. Or you walk down the street and see bouquets scattered all over the ground. Unusual, unlikely, and unmistakably meaningful. That's the thing about synchronicity. It's not random. It feels significant. You don't ignore it. It stirs something in you. In occult philosophy, there's a fascinating idea about this. Synchronicity may be more than a personal experience. It might be a message, a sign, a nudge from something greater than yourself. Something that tells you, yes, you're on the right path. In esotericism, the collective unconscious is not just a concept. It's seen as something real, something that exists beyond the individual, something objective. And synchronicity, closely tied to the unconscious and our emotional charge, seems to be its language. When a person is possessed by an archetype, and don't worry, we all are, all the time, that archetype can begin generating events in the external world. Events that aren't connected by logic or cause, but by meaning. That thought alone is enough to send your mind spiraling. To me, it almost sounds like the image of a higher God, the collective unconscious as a divine intelligence, and all those signs, intuitions, and prophecies, they start to make sense in that light. So now, let's bring it all together. What is tarot, really? Tarot is a symbolic system. Every word matters here. It's not just a deck. It's not random images. It's symbolic, and it's a system. In many ways, tarot is chaos. Beautiful chaos. A symbolic representation of infinity, of infinite meaning, infinite combinations. And like chaos, from within its endless randomness, you can draw structure, pattern, even order. Tarot is both infinite and ordered. It's both wild and precise. And that's why it works. What makes tarot so remarkable isn't just its symbolism, it's its structure. There's a hidden order in how the deck is built. Take the major arcana, for instance. Some say it's divided into 3 groups of 7, called the 3 septenaries, with the Fool standing apart as a card of its own. Not only can the cards be read left to right, but also top to bottom, which means that each card in one row rhymes with those in the same position in other rows. The full tarot deck is made up of 3 distinct arcs. The minor arcana, 40 numbered cards. The court arcana, 16 personality cards. And the major arcana, 22 archetypal images. The minor arcana is divided into 4 suits. Each suit is linked to one of the classical elements, and also to traditional magical tools used in Western esoteric rituals. Cups equals water, pentacles equals earth, swords equals air, wands, fire. Each element brings a specific emotional and symbolic tone to the cards in its suit. The court arcana also follows the 4 elements, but it's even more nuanced. Each of the 4 court cards within a suit is also assigned an element. So each court card is a fusion, its meaning born from the interaction of 2 elemental forces. Minor arcana cards often reflect events or specific scenarios. Court cards usually represent personalities or people involved in those events. And finally, the major arcana. 22 cards, each bearing a powerful archetypal image. These cards are rich in symbolism, often illustrated in full, less abstract than the minors, and more universally recognizable. They depict not just situations or people, but the deep psychological and spiritual forces behind them. Unlike the minor and court arcana, where there's room for variation and creative reinterpretation, the major arcana tends to retain stable, recognizable imagery. These archetypal images have remained consistent over centuries. Sure, artists modernize the style, color, and symbols, but the core essence of each card remains the same. There have been attempts to add new cards to the major arcana or completely redefine its structure, but those ideas rarely take hold. This isn't about tarot readers being traditionalists. It's because the imagery of the major arcana truly is archetypal. It comes from something deeper, the collective unconscious. And until the contents of the collective unconscious evolve, the major arcana won't change. But tarot isn't just a self-contained system. It fits into a larger esoteric framework, one with deep roots in Western mysticism. I'm talking about the Kabbalistic tree of life. This tree consists of 10 spheres, the Sephirot, and each one is associated with a set of 4 minor arcana cards. The first Sephira corresponds to the 4 aces, the second to the 4s, and so on, all the way to the 10s. And in between those 10 Sephirot run connecting paths, and along those paths, we find the major arcana. Now, how the structure of the tarot fits so well into the tree of life is a bit of a mystery. Did this alignment emerge naturally from Kabbalah itself? Or did early occultists reshape the tree just enough to accommodate the tarot? No one can say for certain. What is certain, though, is that tarot integrates into the tree of life in an incredibly harmonious way. Each Sephira has its own field of meaning, its own spiritual resonance, and that energy informs the cards associated with it. And here's a crucial point. The major arcana is not just a collection of archetypes. It represents processes, inner transformations, psychological stages, metaphysical movements. That's what makes these cards so powerful. They don't just symbolize, they move through us. The collective unconscious and the archetypes it holds, they're not static. They're not like ancient gods frozen in stone. They are dynamic, living processes. Throughout our lives, we constantly undergo shifts in archetypes, one transforming into another. So the major arcana, as a mirror of the collective unconscious, cannot be static either. And that's what makes tarot such a deeply universal tool, versatile, adaptable, and meaningful in almost any context. For many practitioners, tarot begins as their first magical tool and remains with them throughout their lives. Just recall, one more time, that massive number of possible card combinations. Now imagine the sheer amount of meaning that emerges from the interaction of those symbols. It's true, indescribable, unfathomable infinity, a universe of meaning held within a deck. I hope this video has helped you see tarot in a new light, to understand more about its inner mechanisms, and perhaps to begin using it more consciously, more deeply, more intentionally.